The scream that tore through the still night air on Richmond's south side in the winter of 1980 didn't sound like something ordinary. It wasn't a fight between drunk neighbors or a stray shout from the nearby bar. It was sharp, desperate, and it carried a kind of terror that made anyone who heard it freeze for a second before pretending they hadn't. In this neighborhood, people minded their own business. Curiosity was dangerous, and asking questions could get you into the kind of trouble you didn't walk away from. The old woman across the hall, Mrs. Turner, would later tell police that she'd heard it. A single high-pitched cry followed by the sound of something crashing. Then silence. A silence that stretched on for far too long before the smell of blood began to seep through the walls. Inside that dimly lit apartment on Hull Street, 29-year-old Patricia Cubbage lay on the kitchen floor, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, her face pale beneath the harsh yellow light. The tiles beneath her were slick with blood, spreading in slow, deliberate tendrils across the floor as if trying to escape. The scene was violent but not chaotic. Whoever had done it hadn't been in a hurry. There was no sign of forced entry. The locks were intact, the windows closed, and her purse sat neatly on the counter beside a pack of cigarettes and a cold cup of coffee. The phone's receiver dangled off the hook as though she'd tried to call someone but never made it past the first ring. Detectives would later say that what struck them most wasn't just the brutality, it was the precision. The cuts were deliberate, the blows controlled, the kind of killing that came from experience, not rage. It wasn't a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. This was personal, and as one investigator quietly murmured while zipping her body into a black bag, somebody wanted her to suffer, but more than that, somebody wanted to send a message. Patricia wasn't just another name on Richmond's crime blotter. She'd been working quietly for the police as an informant for over a year, feeding them information about small-time dealers, stolen car operations, and the kind of backroom deals that fueled the city's growing drug trade. She had started small. Tips about who was moving what on the corners, who was buying stolen goods, where the next shipment might land. But by 1980, she had become one of the most valuable civilian assets the Richmond Police Department had. She was good at what she did, blending in, earning trust, getting close enough to the darkness without letting it swallow her whole. But informant work is a dangerous game. You make friends in the wrong places, and when the wrong person figures out that your loyalty lies elsewhere, there's no second chance. Patricia knew that better than anyone. Just 2 weeks before her death, she'd told her handler that she was being followed. She didn't know by who, only that a dark car had been tailing her at night, and sometimes she could feel eyes on her even when she was alone. "I think they know," she'd said during her last meeting. "I don't know how, but I think someone told them." Her handler, Detective Samuel Brooks, had promised to move her to a safer location, but bureaucracy was slow and protection wasn't given to informants unless the threat was verified. Patricia wasn't a witness yet, just a voice feeding the machine from the shadows. Brooks had written in his report that she seemed nervous, unstable, but now staring at her lifeless body, he couldn't shake the guilt that maybe she hadn't been paranoid after all. The walls of Patricia's apartment told their own story. Newspaper clippings were taped near the kitchen table, articles about recent drug busts, missing persons, and gang-related killings. She had scribbled notes in the margins in messy, hurried handwriting. Names, dates, phone numbers. One clipping was circled in red ink, a report about a major arrest on Richmond's south side involving a man named Victor Crane. Next to his name, Patricia had written just one word: dangerous. Crane was known in the streets but barely touched in the records. He had a reputation for being ruthless, the kind of man who made people disappear quietly. No one knew where he lived or what he looked like exactly, but his influence ran through the veins of Richmond's underground like poison. If Patricia had crossed paths with him, or worse, betrayed him, her death was more than personal. It was punishment. As the forensic team moved through the apartment, One of them found a cigarette still burning in an ashtray beside the phone. The lipstick on the filter was fresh, the smoke curling upward like a ghost refusing to leave. Whoever had killed her hadn't been gone long. Maybe they had waited until she was alone. Maybe they'd even been invited in. On the kitchen counter there were 2 coffee cups, one empty, one half full. That single detail sent chills through Brooks. Patricia hadn't been killed by a stranger breaking in. She'd been murdered by someone she knew. Neighbors were questioned, but most claimed to have seen or heard nothing. A few mentioned a man visiting her earlier that evening. Tall, wearing a brown leather jacket, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. No one recognized him and no one wanted to. Richmond was a city that learned long ago the value of silence. People survived by looking the other way. As the coroner's van pulled away, Brooks lingered outside, watching the flashing lights reflect off the wet pavement. The air smelled of rain and cigarette smoke. He thought about the last time he'd seen Patricia, sitting in the back of an unmarked car, her eyes darting around nervously. Her voice low as she said, "If something happens to me, promise you'll find out who did it." He had laughed then, trying to reassure her. Now those words echoed in his mind like a curse. The press would later label it a gruesome homicide, a tragedy in a dangerous part of town. But within the department, everyone knew this wasn't just another killing. Someone had gone after one of their own. Someone who had been helping them from the inside. And that meant whoever did this wasn't afraid of the police. They wanted the police to know. Back at headquarters, Brooks laid out Patricia's files across his desk, the pages stained with faint smudges of blood where her hands must have touched them last. There were phone numbers, coded notes, lists of people she had met in the last month. One page stood out, a note written in her shaky handwriting that read, "They said I should stop. I think it's too late." He leaned back, rubbing his temples, staring at her name on the report form. Patricia Ann Cubbage. 29 years old, informant, deceased, case pending. But the truth was already clear. Patricia had been marked long before that scream tore through the night. She had been walking a thin line between 2 worlds, one of law and one of lawlessness. And in the end, both sides had turned on her. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent as ever. Cars passed by, bars filled up again, and life resumed its rhythm. But inside that small apartment on Hull Street, the blood on the floor told a different story, one that wouldn't wash away so easily. It was the story of a woman who tried to help, who tried to survive, and who paid the ultimate price for knowing too much. In Richmond that year, the streets whispered her name like a warning. Patricia Cubbage, the informant who turned into the target. Detective Samuel Brooks sat in his car outside the crime scene long after the others had gone. The rhythmic hum of the rain against the windshield blended with the buzz of his thoughts, each one darker than the last. He couldn't stop replaying Patricia's last call in his head, the one she'd made just hours before she died. Her voice had trembled as she whispered that someone was watching her. She had said she saw the same black car again, parked near her apartment building. Brooks had promised to send a unit by, but it was already late, and there were bigger cases on the board that night. He'd told her to lock her doors and call him if anything happened. By the time she tried to, it was already too late. When the forensic reports came back, they didn't make the picture any clearer. There were fingerprints everywhere, most of them belonging to Patricia, and a few smudged ones that couldn't be matched. No sign of forced entry, no defensive wounds, no robbery. Whoever came to that apartment didn't come to steal or argue. They came to kill, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The medical examiner described the attack as methodical and efficient, the kind of violence that suggested a professional. Brooks knew that kind of precision didn't come from the average street criminal. This wasn't random. This was an execution. In the days following her murder, Brooks dove into Patricia's background again, searching for anything that might explain who wanted her dead. Her file was thicker than most. She'd been a witness, a source, and occasionally a liability. She had started working for the police after being arrested for minor drug possession 2 years earlier. Instead of jail, she'd taken the deal. Work off her charges by helping the narcotics unit gather information. She'd been smart, quick, and good at reading people, which made her valuable. But her involvement with the criminal world hadn't ended when she started helping the police. She'd stayed in that life not out of loyalty but necessity. To be useful, she had to be trusted by the people the police were after. That's what made her role so dangerous. She had been the bridge between both worlds, a bridge that someone decided to burn. Brooks went through her notes again, his eyes scanning over every scribbled word, every piece of paper that hinted at something bigger. One name appeared repeatedly: Crane. Patricia had written it beside addresses, phone numbers, and coded symbols. She had drawn a small X next to it each time, as if marking danger. Crane wasn't new to Brooks. He had heard the name whispered before among a ghost in Richmond's underworld. No one knew his first name. No one knew where he came from, but his reach was wide. He was said to handle the kind of business others were too scared to touch. Money laundering, weapons, drugs, even information. If Patricia had been working around him, she had been playing with fire. Brooks reached out to her handler in narcotics, a grizzled detective named Donnie Shaw, who had been in the force for nearly 20 years. Shaw looked exhausted when Brooks found him sitting in the break room, nursing a cup of cold coffee. "You think Crane had her killed?" Brooks asked. Shaw didn't answer right away. He just stared at the table, tapping his fingers slowly. "Crane doesn't kill people himself," he finally said. "He makes people disappear. There's a difference." Brooks frowned. "You think he knew she was talking to us?" Shaw let out a dry laugh. "Everyone knows something in this city, Sam. The only question is who told him." That question would haunt Brooks for weeks. He started visiting the bars Patricia used to frequent, talking to the people she once trusted. Most of them shut down the moment they heard her name. Some pretended they didn't know her. Others warned him to drop it. One man, a bartender at the Rusty Nail, finally broke his silence after a long pause. He said Patricia had come in the night before her death, jumpy and pale, constantly looking toward the door. She had ordered a drink but barely touched it. "She told me she'd done something stupid," the bartender said quietly. "She said she'd told the wrong person something she shouldn't have." When Brooks pressed him for details, the man just shook his head. She didn't say who, but she looked scared, like she knew her time was running out. Back at the precinct, Brooks spread photos across his desk. Patricia smiling in her ID photo, the crime scene shots, the half-burned photograph found under her couch. That picture disturbed him the most. Patricia stood next to a man whose face was barely visible, but the build, the hair, the watch on his wrist, it all matched Crane's vague description. The picture had been torn in half and burned at the edges, the remaining portion smeared with what looked like blood. On the back, written in smeared red ink, were the words, "Snitches die first." Brooks leaned back in his chair, the cigarette between his fingers burning down to the filter. The message wasn't subtle. Someone had wanted her death to be noticed. Someone wanted the others, maybe other informants, to see it as a warning. The Richmond police had been pushing hard against the drug trade that year, cracking down on suppliers and middlemen. If Patricia had been helping them build a case against Crane's network, that could have been reason enough for her death. But Brooks couldn't shake the feeling that this went deeper than that. In one of her files, Patricia had mentioned that she suspected someone inside the department was leaking information. "I think someone's feeding them my movements," she had written in a shaky hand. "Every time I set up a meet, they know." It wasn't a baseless fear. There had been rumors of corruption within the force. Detectives taking kickbacks, cases going cold when they got too close to the wrong people. Brooks didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was starting to point in that direction. If Patricia had been betrayed, it might not have been by a criminal. It might have been by someone wearing the same badge as him. He met with Shaw again to go over the case notes, but Shaw seemed uneasy. "You're digging too deep," he warned. "If Crane's involved, leave it. You don't want to end up like her." Brooks ignored him. He couldn't. Something about Patricia's death felt personal now. She had trusted him, and he'd failed her. Every night he replayed her voice on the phone, that tremble, that desperation, and it ate at him. One night, while combing through police reports, he found something that made his stomach tighten. A black Chevy Impala had been spotted near Patricia's apartment the night of her murder. The car was registered to a man named Harold Briggs, a former detective who had been forced to resign 2 years earlier after an internal investigation found he had ties to organized crime. Briggs had vanished after his dismissal, but his name had resurfaced recently in connection with Crane's operations. Brooks drove to the address listed on Briggs's old file, an abandoned warehouse near the edge of town. The place looked dead, but inside he found something that made his pulse quicken: Patricia's missing files. They were stacked neatly on a table, her handwriting clear on the covers. Every lead, every name, every operation she'd been involved in, all laid out like trophies. But one folder was missing. It was the one labeled Operation Iron Web, the case she had been helping the police build against Crane's organization. Brooks realized that someone had killed her to keep that file from surfacing. He left the warehouse with the papers clutched under his arm, his heart pounding. Patricia had been right. Someone inside the system was working with Crane, and they'd killed her to make sure she couldn't expose them. As he stood outside in the cold night, looking at the city skyline glowing faintly in the distance, he made himself a silent promise. He was going to find out who betrayed her, no matter how deep it went, no matter who it was. Patricia Cubbage had been scared, but she had still tried to do the right thing. Brooks owed her that much. And somewhere out there, the man known as Crane was watching, waiting, knowing that his message had been received. The informant who talked too much was gone, but the real war in Richmond had just begun. Detective Samuel Brooks couldn't sleep for nights after finding Patricia's missing files in that abandoned warehouse. The discovery had opened a door he couldn't close. Every page, every scribbled note, every name in those files hinted at a network so deep that it reached beyond the city's criminal underworld and right into the badge he wore. The warehouse was supposed to be empty, but the way the papers were arranged told him someone had been there recently. The air had still smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, and on one of the tables a cup of coffee had left a fresh ring on the wood. Whoever had Patricia's files before him had been close, maybe even watching. He felt it in his gut that the moment he took those papers, he'd stepped into something much bigger than a murder investigation. The first thing he did was go through every file line by line. Patricia's notes were messy, full of code words and abbreviations only she understood. But Brooks had worked with her long enough to make sense of some of them. She had documented meetings, payoffs, and deals happening across Richmond's south side, all tied to a man she referred to only as C. There were phone numbers, times, and even coded references to drop points. At the center of it all was Operation Iron Web, the one file that was missing. From what he could piece together, it wasn't just about drug trafficking. It was about a network of protection and silence. Patricia had written in one margin, "They're not scared of the law. They own parts of it." Brooks brought his findings to his superior, Captain Miller, an older man who had seen his share of corruption but always seemed careful about which doors he opened. Miller frowned when Brooks told him about the warehouse. "You went there alone?" he asked. Brooks nodded. "You shouldn't have," Miller said quietly. "There are cases you can't touch, not without clearance." Brooks knew what that meant. It was a warning disguised as advice. He left Miller's office with a bitter taste in his mouth. If Miller wasn't surprised by what Brooks had found, that meant he already knew. Back at his desk, Brooks lit another cigarette, staring at Patricia's torn photograph. The man beside her, the one who had to be Crane, haunted him. How close had she gotten to him? Had she been pretending to be loyal while feeding the police information? Or had she crossed a line she couldn't come back from? He couldn't stop thinking about the look on her face in that photo. The forced smile, the fear hiding just beneath her eyes. Patricia had always been brave, but bravery had limits and Crane had a reputation for finding them. Brooks needed proof, something solid that would connect Crane and the missing file. He tracked down a man named Luther Wade, a low-level courier who'd once been part of Crane's operation. Luther had been in and out of jail for years, but he knew things, and for the right price he was willing to talk. Brooks met him in a parking lot behind a run-down diner just off Broad Street. Luther was jittery, his hands shaking as he spoke. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, glancing around. "Crane's got a cop on his payroll. Always has. That's how he stays one step ahead. Every time someone starts talking, their name gets passed along." Brooks leaned forward, his voice low. "Who's the cop?" Luther swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the shadows. "I don't know his name, but they call him the Ghost. Doesn't show up in the system, doesn't exist on paper. But he's real and he's dangerous. Your girl at Patricia, she got too close. She started asking questions she wasn't supposed to. That's why she's dead." Brooks felt his stomach tighten. If Luther was telling the truth, it meant Patricia hadn't just been killed for what she knew. She'd been killed by a system built to protect the very people she was helping to expose. Before Brooks could press for more, a car's headlights flared across the lot. Luther's eyes widened. "You didn't bring anyone?" he whispered. Brooks turned, but before he could answer, the car screeched away. Luther was gone, vanishing into the night like smoke. Brooks knew better than to chase him. In this city, the people who talked never stayed alive for long. The next day, Brooks received an anonymous envelope slid under his office door. Inside was a cassette tape and a small note that read, "She tried to warn you." He recognized the handwriting immediately. Patricia's. His hands trembled as he pushed the tape into the player. Static filled the room, followed by her voice, quiet but steady. "Detective Brooks, if you're hearing this, I think I'm in trouble. I don't know who to trust anymore. Every time I tell someone something, it gets back to them. Someone inside the department is feeding Crane. I think I found something big. Operation Iron Web isn't just about drugs. It's about money, power, and names you wouldn't believe. If something happens to me, don't let them bury this." Brooks sat frozen. She'd known. She'd been one step away from uncovering the truth before someone silenced her. And now the only people who could help him were the ones he couldn't trust. He decided to keep the tape secret. If word got out that he had it, he might be next. He began digging into old police reports, financial records, and case files connected to Crane's network. Patterns started to emerge. Evidence that cases against Crane had been dropped without explanation. Evidence disappearing. Witnesses recanting their statements after talking to unknown officers. The deeper he dug, the more it looked like someone within the department was deliberately protecting Crane's empire. Patricia had been right all along. Brooks didn't notice how closely he was being watched until it was too late. His car was broken into twice, though nothing was stolen. His home phone line developed a strange static, and one night when he returned to his apartment, he found the door unlocked even though he was sure he'd locked it. Nothing was missing, but on the kitchen table there was a single cigarette butt in the ashtray, the same brand Patricia smoked. It was a message. Someone wanted him to know they'd been there. The pressure grew heavier. Captain Miller started assigning him to smaller, meaningless cases, trying to keep him away from Patricia's file. Other detectives stopped talking to him. A few avoided eye contact entirely. He could feel the invisible walls closing in. He had crossed a line and now he was on his own. But Brooks wasn't ready to walk away. One night he went back to the warehouse where he had found Patricia's files. The place was dark and cold, the air thick with mildew. As he walked deeper inside, he noticed something new. A faint light flickering from the back room. He drew his gun and approached slowly, the floor creaking under his boots. When he pushed open the door, his heart skipped. On the wall was a message scrawled in red paint. "You're next, detective." Beneath it lay another photograph. This one of him, taken outside the precinct just days earlier. Brooks realized then that Patricia's killers were still watching, still one step ahead. The truth she'd died trying to expose wasn't buried at all. It was alive, moving, breathing inside the very institution meant to protect people like her. He took the tape, the photos, and what was left of her notes, locking them away in a safe deposit box under a false name. If anything happened to him, someone would eventually find them. Then he did something reckless. He started talking, quietly at first, to the few people he still trusted, trying to rally them into reopening Patricia's case. But each time he got close to convincing someone, something happened. A transfer, a resignation, a sudden reassignment. The system was cleaning itself before he could expose it. Patricia had once written in her notes, "They think they're untouchable." She'd been right. But Brooks wasn't ready to stop fighting. He had already lost one good person to this web of corruption, and he wasn't going to let her death be forgotten. The deeper he went, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Patricia's murder. It was about the soul of Richmond itself, a city rotting from within. He poured himself another cup of stale coffee and stared at the evidence spread across his desk. Her voice echoed in his mind. The way she'd said, "Don't trust anyone, not even the badge beside you." He whispered back into the empty room, "I won't." Outside, thunder rolled over the city as if warning him to stop. But Brooks didn't believe in omens anymore. He believed in the truth, and he knew that Patricia Cubbage had died for it. Now it was his turn to finish what she started, even if it meant going down the same road she did. The call came in just after dawn on a cold February morning, 3 weeks after Patricia's murder. An anonymous voice told dispatch there was something buried near the old docks by the James River. Brooks didn't wait for backup. He drove there alone, the rising sun turning the mist above the water into a dull orange haze. The place was quiet except for the soft lap of waves against the wooden posts. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful. He parked the car and walked toward the edge of the dock, the boards creaking under his weight. The smell of rot and river water filled the air. For a long moment there was nothing, just the sound of his own breathing. Then he saw it, a glint of something metallic beneath a rotted plank near the base of the pier. He pried it loose and found a small box, rusted and wrapped tightly in layers of black plastic. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. Inside was a stack of papers, Patricia's missing notes, soaked but still legible, and a cassette tape labeled simply, "Insurance." For a long time he just stared at it. The word itself felt heavy, deliberate. Patricia had always been careful, always one step ahead of danger until the night had caught up with her. This was her final card, the one she must have hidden when she knew they were coming. Back at the precinct, Brooks slipped the tape into an old player and pressed play. Static filled the room, then her voice came through, soft, steady, and heartbreakingly calm. "If you're hearing this, they got me," Patricia said. "Don't trust anyone, not even the badge beside you. The file you're looking for, Iron Web, where it's not just about Crane, it's about everyone connected to him. There are names, officers, politicians, even a judge. They're all tied together. If you try to take them down, they'll come for you too. But don't let them bury this." Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. The tape went on for almost 15 minutes, naming locations, coded transactions, and specific dates, enough to implicate people at the highest levels. She spoke of payoffs made in warehouses, of evidence quietly destroyed, of witnesses who were never meant to survive long enough to testify. "You always told me to trust the system," she said near the end, her voice breaking for the first time. "But the system's broken, Sam. And you can't fix it if you're part of it. When the tape stopped, Brooks sat in silence. He didn't move for several minutes. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. Patricia had known she would die, and even in her final moments she had been trying to protect the truth. He took the tape out and hid it inside his desk drawer behind a loose panel. Then he called in a favor from one of the few people he still trusted, a journalist named Laura Reese, who had written about police corruption before. When he met Laura that night at a quiet diner outside of town, he laid out the papers and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she said, "If what you're saying is true, this is bigger than just one case. You'll be risking your career, maybe even your life." Brooks nodded. "Patricia already did," he said. "Someone has to make sure it meant something." They agreed to work in secret. Laura would verify the documents, cross-reference the names, and prepare to publish everything once they had enough proof. Brooks would keep digging from inside the department, feeding her what he could without drawing suspicion. It was dangerous, but it was the only way. Over the next few weeks, Brooks lived like a man being hunted. He could feel eyes on him wherever he went. Once he caught sight of a black car in his rearview mirror, the same make and model that had followed Patricia. Another time his apartment door was left slightly ajar, though nothing inside had been touched. The message was clear. They knew he was still digging. Captain Miller called him into his office one afternoon. The blinds were closed, the air heavy with tension. "You're being watched, Sam," Miller said. "There are people asking questions about you, about Patricia's case. Maybe it's time you let it go." Brooks looked at him, searching his face for some sign of guilt. "Did you know?" he asked quietly. Miller's expression didn't change. "You're walking into something you can't handle. Do yourself a favor and walk back out." That was the last conversation they ever had. 2 nights later, Laura called, her voice shaking. "Sam, I think someone's been in my apartment," she whispered. "My notes are gone, my files too. Whoever they are, they're fast." He told her to get out of town, to stay with someone she trusted. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. By morning, she was gone. Her car was found abandoned on a rural road miles outside Richmond. No sign of her, no body. Just like Patricia, she had vanished into the city's silence. That was the breaking point. Brooks stopped following procedure. He stopped writing reports. He started gathering evidence on his own, copying every document, recording every conversation that even hinted at corruption. He drove to every location Patricia had mentioned on the tape, finding small pieces that confirmed her story. Hidden ledgers, discarded receipts, even a storage locker filled with unmarked evidence boxes. He realized that what she'd uncovered wasn't just about drugs or money. It was about control. The network she called Iron Web was a machine that kept the city's balance of power exactly where a few men wanted it. And the police, knowingly or not, were its gears. Eventually, he decided to turn the tape over to the state attorney's office. It was a risk, but he had no other option. Within 24 hours of submitting the evidence, his badge was suspended, and an internal affairs investigation was opened against him. They accused him of tampering with evidence, of fabricating a conspiracy. He was told to surrender his weapon and stay home until further notice. The message couldn't have been clearer. They were shutting him down. But the story didn't die there. Someone leaked portions of the tape to the press, and within days, whispers began spreading through the city. Reporters started asking questions. The words Operation Iron Web appeared in headlines for the first time. The department scrambled to control the narrative, but the damage was done. A grand jury was convened in secret. 3 officers were quietly suspended. 2 others suddenly resigned and disappeared. The corruption that Patricia had died trying to expose was finally being dragged into the light. Brooks watched it all unfold from a distance, a man without a badge but not without purpose. He knew the fight wasn't over. It never would be. Crane was still out there somewhere, and the people at the top would always find new ways to hide. But for the first time, Patricia's name was being spoken not as a victim, but as a warning. Her courage had cracked something open that couldn't be sealed again. One evening, long after the headlines had faded and the city had moved on, Brooks drove to Oakwood Cemetery. Patricia's grave sat near the back, shaded by an old oak tree. The stone was simple: her name, the year she was born, and the year she died. Someone had left a single white rose. He knelt beside it, pulling a pack of cigarettes from his coat. Lighting one, he exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl upward into the cold night air. "You were right all along," he murmured. "They never wanted justice, but you gave them no choice." He sat there for a while, the city's sounds faint in the distance. Sirens, laughter, the hum of traffic. Somewhere out there, life was still going on, and maybe that was what Patricia had wanted all along. For someone to keep fighting even when the world went dark. Before he left, he placed the last copy of the tape inside a small metal tin and buried it beside her headstone. "If they ever try to bury you again," he said softly, "you'll still have a voice." As he walked away, the wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of the river through the trees. For the first time in months, Brooks felt something like peace. Not because justice had been served, but because the truth had finally been spoken. Patricia Cubbage, the informant who had become a target, had changed Richmond forever. Her death had forced the city to look at itself in the mirror, and even if the reflection was ugly, it was real. In the end, she hadn't just been a victim. She'd been a spark, one that lit a fire too bright for anyone to snuff out. And for Detective Brooks, that was enough.